It is one of the oldest theological questions in the world, and most people think they already know the answer. 2,000 years ago, a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth walked through Galilee and Judea, gathered followers, performed what his supporters believed were miracles, and was executed by the Roman authorities. His followers declared him the Messiah, the long-promised Redeemer foretold in the Hebrew Scriptures. Christianity was born from that declaration, and today over 2 billion people on earth believe that Jesus was exactly who his followers said he was. But the Jewish people, the very people whose scriptures contain the Messianic prophecies, the very people from whom Jesus himself came, did not accept that claim. Not then, not in the centuries that followed, not today. And for most of human history, this refusal has been treated as a mystery, a failure, or a sin, depending on who was doing the talking. Christians have spent 2 millennia asking why the Jews rejected their own Messiah. Entire theologies have been built around the question. Wars have been fought over it. Millions have died because of it. But here is what almost nobody does. Almost nobody asks the Jewish people to explain their own reasoning in their own terms. And when you actually listen to what Jewish theology says, the answer is not stubborn blindness or spiritual failure. It is a coherent, detailed, scripturally grounded theological position that most Christians have never heard articulated. Not because it was hidden, but because for most of history, nobody in power wanted it to be heard. This is not a video about who is right. This is a video about what each side actually believes and why. And if you have only ever heard one side of this argument, you are about to hear the other. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. The first thing you need to understand is that the Jewish concept of the Messiah and the Christian concept of the Messiah are fundamentally different. Not slightly different. Fundamentally different. They share some vocabulary and some scriptural sources, but the expectations they describe are so divergent that they are, in practice, describing 2 entirely different events. In Jewish theology, the Messiah is a human being, not a divine being. He is expected to be a direct biological descendant of King David through the male line, a flesh and blood king, not a God incarnate. His role is not spiritual salvation in the afterlife. His role is concrete, observable, and verifiable in the physical world. According to the Hebrew Scriptures, as interpreted by mainstream Jewish tradition, the Messiah is expected to accomplish specific things during his lifetime. He will rebuild the third temple in Jerusalem. The prophet Ezekiel describes this in detail, envisioning a restored temple where the presence of God will dwell permanently among the people of Israel. He will gather all the Jewish people from exile back to the land of Israel. The prophet Isaiah writes that God will gather the dispersed of Israel from the 4 corners of the earth. He will usher in an era of universal peace, in which nation will not lift up sword against nation, and humanity will no longer learn war. Isaiah describes this era explicitly. And it is one of the most central messianic expectations in Jewish thought, and he will bring about universal knowledge of the God of Israel, so that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea, as the prophet Habakkuk describes. These are not metaphorical expectations for most of Jewish theology. They are literal, they are observable. And the critical point is this: they are supposed to happen during the Messiah's lifetime, not at some later return. The Messiah either accomplishes these things, or he is not the Messiah. There is no concept in traditional Jewish theology of a Messiah who comes, fails to complete the mission, dies, and then comes back later to finish the job. That framework, the idea of a second coming, is a Christian innovation. It does not exist in the Hebrew Scriptures as Jewish tradition reads them. From the Jewish perspective, evaluating Jesus against these criteria is straightforward. The temple was not rebuilt. In fact, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, roughly 40 years after Jesus' death. Far from the temple being restored, it was obliterated, and it has not been rebuilt to this day. The Jewish people were not gathered from exile. The opposite happened. After the destruction of the temple and the failed revolts against Rome, the diaspora expanded dramatically. Jews were scattered further across the Roman world and beyond. 2,000 years later, millions of Jews still live in diaspora. Universal peace did not arrive. The centuries following Jesus' death saw continuous warfare, including wars fought explicitly in his name. The Crusades, the wars of religion in Europe, the two world wars, and conflicts that continue to this day. The world after Jesus was not a world at peace. By any measurable standard, the Messianic era of peace described by Isaiah did not materialize. And universal knowledge of God, in the specific sense that Jewish theology means it, did not occur. The world remains divided among competing religions, atheism, agnosticism, and countless belief systems. The prophetic vision of all humanity united in the knowledge of the God of Israel has not been fulfilled. For Jewish theology, this is not a close call. The Messiah is defined by his accomplishments. If those accomplishments did not happen, the person in question, however righteous, however wise, however influential, is not the Messiah. The great medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides codified this position in his Mishnah Torah, writing that if a person is presumed to be the Messiah but is killed before completing the messianic tasks, then he is not the one promised by the Torah. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Beyond the question of unfulfilled prophecies, there is a theological objection that runs even deeper. Christianity does not merely claim that Jesus was the Messiah, it claims that Jesus was divine, the Son of God, the second person of a triune Godhead consisting of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. For mainstream Jewish theology, that claim is not just wrong, it is incompatible with the most fundamental principle of Judaism itself. The Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith, recited daily by observant Jews for over 3,000 years, states, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This is not a statement about God being the most important God among many. It is a statement of absolute, indivisible, unqualified oneness. God has no body, no physical form, no divisions, no partners, and no offspring. This is not a peripheral belief in Judaism. It is the foundation. Everything else rests on it. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity, in which God exists as three persons in one substance, is seen by Jewish theology as a violation of absolute monotheism. The idea that God could become a human being, could be born of a woman, could suffer and die on a cross, contradicts the Jewish understanding of God's nature at the most fundamental level. Maimonides, in his 13 Principles of Faith, states explicitly that God has no body and that physical concepts do not apply to God. The worship of any human being, no matter how righteous, is considered a form of idolatry in Jewish law, which is one of the most severe prohibitions in the entire Torah. This is not a minor theological disagreement. It is a clash between two irreconcilable conceptions of the nature of God. For Christianity, the incarnation of God in human form is the central miracle and the central truth of the faith. For Judaism, it is precisely the kind of claim that the Torah warns against. Adding another layer of complexity are the scriptural passages that Christians cite as prophecies fulfilled by Jesus, several of which Jewish scholars argue are based on mistranslations or misreadings of the Hebrew text. The most famous example is Isaiah 7 verse 14, which in many Christian translations reads, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." This verse is cited as a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. But the Hebrew word used in the original text is alma, which means young woman, not virgin. The Hebrew word for virgin is betula, a different word entirely. Jewish scholars argue that the Christian translation introduced the concept of a virgin birth that does not exist in the original Hebrew, and that the passage in context is referring to a child who would be born during the lifetime of King Ahaz as a sign related to a specific political crisis, not to an event 700 years in the future. Another disputed passage is Isaiah 53, the famous suffering servant chapter, which describes a figure who is despised and rejected, who bore our griefs and carried our sorrows, and who was wounded for our transgressions. Christianity reads this as a prophecy of Jesus' suffering and crucifixion. Jewish interpretation, however, has traditionally read the suffering servant not as an individual Messiah, but as the nation of Israel itself, suffering on behalf of the world. The grammatical structure of the Hebrew, Jewish scholars argue, supports a collective rather than individual reading, and the surrounding chapters in Isaiah use servant repeatedly to refer to the nation of Israel as a whole. These are not modern objections invented to counter Christianity. The medieval rabbi Nachmanides made many of these arguments in a famous public disputation in Barcelona in 1263, debating before King James I of Aragon. Jewish scholars have been articulating these textual critiques for as long as the two faiths have existed side by side. There is one more factor that shapes the Jewish rejection of Jesus, and it has nothing to do with theology. It has to do with history and violence. For nearly 2,000 years, the claim that Jesus was the Messiah has been accompanied by violence against the people who refused to accept it. The Crusaders who massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland in 1096 did so in the name of Christ. The Spanish Inquisition tortured and expelled Jews who would not convert. The blood libel, the fabricated accusation that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes, was explicitly connected to the charge that Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. Pogroms across Eastern Europe were fueled by Easter sermons that blamed Jews for the crucifixion. And the Holocaust, while driven by racial rather than religious anti-Semitism, drew on centuries of Christian anti-Jewish theology that had conditioned European civilization to view Jews as enemies of God. This history does not disprove Christian theology. But it does explain why the question, "Why don't Jews believe in Jesus?" lands differently when asked by a Jewish person than when asked by a Christian. For many Jews, the claim that Jesus was the Messiah is inseparable from the violence that has been committed in his name against their people. The Messiah, in Jewish understanding, is supposed to bring peace. The historical experience of Jews with Christianity has been the opposite of peace. That lived experience reinforces the theological objections in ways that are impossible to separate. What makes this disagreement so enduring is that both sides are reading the same texts and arriving at completely different conclusions. Christians read Isaiah 53 and see Jesus on the cross. Jews read Isaiah 53 and see the nation of Israel suffering in exile. Christians read Daniel's prophecy of the Son of Man and see a divine figure descending from heaven. Jews read the same passage and see a human king who will rule with justice. Christians see the Messiah's death and resurrection as the fulfillment of a divine plan that transcends the original expectations. Jews see a set of unfulfilled criteria that mean the job has not been done. Neither side is being dishonest. Both are operating within their own interpretive traditions that diverged nearly 2,000 years ago and have been developing independently ever since. The Jewish reading of the Hebrew Scriptures is grounded in a tradition of interpretation that predates Christianity. The Christian reading is grounded in a tradition that reinterpreted those same scriptures in light of the life and death of Jesus. Both traditions are internally consistent. They simply start from different premises and arrive at different conclusions. Understanding this does not require choosing a side. It requires understanding that the question itself, why did the Jews reject Jesus, is framed from a Christian perspective that assumes Jesus was the Messiah and asks why the Jews failed to see it. The Jewish framing of the same question is entirely different. From the Jewish perspective, they did not reject their Messiah. They evaluated a candidate against the criteria their scriptures established, concluded that the criteria were not met, and continued waiting. They are still waiting. From their perspective, they have every scriptural reason to do so. That is the answer most people have never heard. Not because it is secret, but because for most of history, the power dynamics between Christianity and Judaism made it dangerous for Jews to articulate their position openly. When the price of disagreement was expulsion, forced conversion, or death, theological debate was not a luxury most Jewish communities could afford. The arguments existed, the rabbis wrote them down. But they circulated within Jewish communities, not outside them. Today, for the first time in 2,000 years, both sides of this argument can be heard freely. Understanding both does not weaken either faith. It strengthens the conversation between them. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Thank you for watching. If you want to go deeper, the next video on your screen is one you will not want to miss. I will see you there.